The Bible says here in Matthew chapter number 17 and verse number 14, "And when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man kneeling down to him, and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic and sore vexed. For oft times he falleth into the fire, and oft into the water. And I brought him to thy disciples, and they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. And Jesus rebuked the devil, and he departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Then came the disciples to Jesus apart, and said, Why could we not cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting." Before we begin this morning, let's look in prayer. Father, we come before your throne of grace this morning. Lord, we are thankful to once again be in your presence. Lord, we ask now that you'd bless the preaching of your word. I pray, Lord, for an unction from on high. I also ask, dear God, that your Spirit be pleased to take your word and empower it in a way that only you can, Lord. Make it real, Father, make it effective. I pray to find root in our heart, that we'd grow from it, Lord, that we'd learn from it. We also ask, Father, that you'd be glorified this morning and exalted here in our midst. We ask all these things in the name of your precious Son. Amen. Thank you. You all can be seated. Matthew 17 and verse 14 is where our text picks up for this morning. We'll also go to the book of Mark to fill in some of this episode in the life of Christ. So we'll go there in just a few moments. When we come to verse 14, the story picks up right where it left off in verse 13. A quick reminder. At the beginning of Matthew 17, Jesus and Peter, James, and John, they go up into a mountain. And in that mountain, Jesus is transfigured there. It is but a glimpse of the deity of Jesus. And it would have been a powerful moment to witness. I was listening to a sermon whose text was also there earlier this week, and I can't even begin to fathom what it would have been like to witness Jesus in a little bit more of his deity, but also then to witness Moses and Elias. I mean, that would have sent a chill down my spine, to say the very least. After, of course, all that, we looked at that 2 Sundays ago, and we know, for whatever reason, Peter felt led to tell Jesus that he would love to make a tabernacle. I don't know if Luke tells us he didn't know what he was saying. Maybe he was so taken back he had to feel the silent awesomeness that was taking place. And as they're coming back down the mountain, that leads to a discussion about the prophecies about Elijah. And they kind of came back to them. I like what one preacher said back in synagogue school. Keep in mind, they didn't have Sunday school, but synagogue school, I'm sure they heard the stories that Elijah would come before the Messiah. And now they know that Jesus is the Messiah, but it occurs to them that Elijah didn't come. And so Christ makes clear there in verse number 12 and 13 that Elijah did come in the person of John the Baptist. Well, once they come back down off the mountain, which is inevitable, you always have to come back down off of the mountain, so to speak, they arrive onto a scene where there is nothing less than chaos taking place at the foot of the mountain, at the bottom there. Mark, and to a lesser extent Luke, give us more details of what was going on while Christ, Peter, James, and John were on the mountaintop, and the setting of the scene when they came back down from said mountaintop. Both Mark and Luke record, we read here in verse 14, Matthew jumps right into the action, but both Mark and Luke record for us that there was a crowd or a multitude at the bottom of the mountain, and they were probably surrounding the rest of the 9 apostles who did not go with Jesus. Mark makes special note that they're talking to some scribes, and they're probably being questioned by the scribes. Now, by this time, it's a familiar story, so I'm sure there's no spoilers for all of us here this morning. But by this time, one would imagine that they had already tried to cast out the demon from this boy, and they couldn't do it. And some sanctified imagination tells us that most likely when the scribes saw them fail in casting out this demon, they jumped at the opportunity and they started questioning them and wondering why they couldn't do it. And they probably used this as proof that Jesus is not actually sent from God, that he's not actually the Messiah. Along with all of this, you have the crowd who's witnessed everything going on. You have the crowd witnessing probably the conversation between the scribes and the rest of the apostles. And along with all of that, you can imagine two other details in this scene. The first ones were the disciples, who were probably bumfuzzled why they couldn't cast out this demon. They were probably surprised. I mean, they'd done it before. They'd been given power and authority to do so back in Matthew 10, but now they couldn't do it, and so they were probably wondering about that. And on top of that, in a much more personal sense, the father of the boy that we read of here probably sunk to a deeper depth of despair, not really knowing what to do next. We know the rumors had grown by this point, and we know that Jesus had a reputation that preceded him. I'm fairly certain, based on the events of Matthew 10, that the apostles probably had some kind of a reputation as well. And so when the father went there and hoping that he could find healing for his only child, I think Luke is the one who gives us that detail, I'm sure he was heartbroken when they couldn't cast out the demon. In summary, this scene is the exact opposite of what it would have been on the mountaintop. There was this glorious, transcendent peace and tranquility that can only come from the very nature of God, as opposed to this chaotic mess that was at the bottom, at the foot of the mountains. I think it was Matthew Henry who wisely pointed out the powerful reminder of what things are like without the presence of Jesus. I'm sure that when Jesus was with them, the 12 probably felt kind of invincible, for better, for worse. And now, not only is Jesus gone, but the three, kind of the leaders of the 12, they were gone. And so one could only imagine how chaotic they themselves felt. And all of this would have continued on the same way if Jesus would have never showed up. But when he did, something happened, something powerful happened to most, if not all, who were present there. This brings us to the condition of the boy. And you'll notice here, Matthew gives us a glimpse that all the boy was suffering. He says there in verse number 15, the father speaking, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic." It was believed back then, in both Gill and Matthew Henry, and I don't know if by that point it had been seen otherwise, but the word lunatic, it carried this kind of madness, they thought, that had the moon and its phases had an effect on. Therefore, that is a lunatic. We get our word lunar from the same word that we get lunatic from. They thought it was tied to the phases of the moon. But needless to say, there was something mentally wrong with the boy. But he goes on to say that he's sore vexed. In other words, he's suffering. The idea there is he's a victim. Someone is harming this poor child. And he explains the vexation. He says, "For oftentimes he falleth into a fire, and oft into the water." Now, this would have been a horrible experience to go through back during this time, and we see this still in third world countries. It was like this in some of the places in the Philippines I grew up. It was kind of common to have a fire going on. Obviously, they didn't have indoor electricity like we have now. It wasn't until after a few years of all of this. And so it was a common thing. They had a fire going, and apparently this boy would just all of a sudden fall or maybe even jump into that fire and into bodies of water. I mean, keep in mind that the sea life was a very prevalent thing during this time in the nation of Israel. And one could only imagine what the father was going through, because if it was mere lunacy, that'd be one thing. But to see his son fall into fires, into waters, it would have been, needless to say, heartbreaking. Luke and Mark give us a fuller picture. Hold your place in Matthew if you all would. Go first with me to the book of Luke, just to kind of get a broader picture of how this boy was suffering. It says here, when they bring him to Christ, and we'll come back to this in just a moment, but Luke tells us there in verse 39, "And lo, a spirit taketh him, and he suddenly crieth out, and it teareth him, that he foameth again, and bruising him hardly departeth from him. Even in just that moment, this honestly would have been a horrific sight to see if you would have been present there at that time. And go over to Mark, if you would, with me. Mark chapter 9 as well, in verse number 17 and 18, and then down to verse 20 and 22. Here in Mark chapter 9 and verse 17 and 18, you all can actually put a bookmark here, as we'll come back to this in just a few moments. But in Luke chapter 9 and verse 17, one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. So he couldn't speak. The boy was mute from an outside source. He hath a dumb spirit, and whatsoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples, and they could, that they should cast him out, and they could not. And then verse 22 and 20 and 22 also repeated again. And they brought him to him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming. Then down to verse 22. And oftentimes, as we read in Matthew, it cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. So my point is that this is, and most writers point this out as well, this probably would have been the most jarring sight of demonic possession there was within the ministry of Jesus. I really like the way Chuck Swindoll summarizes all of this. He lists it out for us. He writes, he was mute, but able to scream. We saw that he had a dumb spirit, and yet he cried out. He was being slammed to the ground and would become stiff. He would foam at the mouth and grind his teeth. He would convulse and roll on the ground. He was being thrown into fire and water, and he was being physically injured after each attack. The point is, this wouldn't have been a pleasant picture. It would have been horrific for the father to experience, and would have been a very jarring sight for the multitude to witness. And as we could imagine, the father was absolutely heartbroken. We all know what it's like to have a child who is sick and not feeling well. And the fact that this poor boy was possessed and being oppressed by a demon, I don't know that there would have been anything worse to witness. Again, use a little bit of sanctified imagination. I imagine, I don't have a chapter and verse for this, so I don't say it dogmatically, but I imagine that maybe, and the Bible, as far as we can tell, based upon the events that have taken place, they're probably in Caesarea Philippi, another region there in the nation of Israel. And so I imagine, again, no chapter and verse, but I imagine that maybe he thought, hey, they're closer. Now I can make it over there now. They've been traveling a lot, but they're here in Caesarea Philippi. I can make it over there. So I'm going to bring my boy, and I know they've cast out demons. They've healed all sorts of people. I mean, he just fed like 40,000 people not too long. I know if there's anyone that could help my little boy, it would be them. And so I would imagine there's probably a glimmer of hope as he approached those 9 apostles. Jesus wasn't there, but it's okay, because he authorized his disciples. And so as he approached the disciples, one could imagine there was just a glimmer of hope that finally he would find peace and healing for his child. But when he arrived, he was sorely disappointed, and as stated, he probably sunk to a new kind of low. He was heartbroken. Even here, he witnessed his only child, who had been tormented for so long, become even more tormented. And one of the only places he could find hope and relief, that very place had disappointed him. Now, what's interesting about this is Jesus' initial response, and it's a little bit mysterious. No one really knows who he was addressing. You'll notice there back in Matthew chapter number 17, we'll be in Mark in just a moment, but back in Matthew chapter 17, upon the Father going to Jesus, Jesus responds first and foremost by saying, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you?" There's almost this sense of exasperation on the part of Jesus, where he's almost fed up with someone or society as a whole. Some writers have the idea that it was to the disciples, that, as we'll see in just a moment, and it's an important topic that we can't go through quickly. Some say it was toward the disciples. be it filled with pride or some kind of unfounded confidence. They could now, because of unbelief, not cast out the devil, this demon. And so maybe he's somewhat exasperated with them. Some say it was the scribes or any other religious leaders that were present, because the faithless and perverse generation was a phrase he often used for them. One writer submits, and I would agree with this a little bit more, that he was kind of addressing everyone who was present to varying degrees. He was addressing the disciples because by this point, arguably, they should have been more spiritually grounded, but they weren't. I mean, we're going to read it there in chapter 18, just following this story, not to spoil the next few sermons, but by the time we get to chapter 18, they ask Jesus the question, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Really? I mean, you've seen all these things. You have been commissioned by the thrice holy God-man, and your first and foremost concern is who's going to be the greatest? So maybe Christ was kind of scolding them because he knew how immature they still were. He was scolding the scribes and religious leaders because they were rampant idolaters. They could make excuses all they wanted. They could exalt the law of Moses, but at the end of every day, they wanted nothing to do with God, and they had everything to do with their own self-righteousness that brought them all kind of praise and glory from those around them. He was fed up with the multitudes and the crowds because we've read, and Mark kind of emphasized a little bit more, there were at least one or two towns where Christ would go, and the Bible tells us he could do no miracles there because of their unbelief. The idea was a self-limiting kind of power, if you will, or a self-limitation, I should say. But the idea is these towns wanted nothing to do with Jesus. He was there, and for better, for worse, he could heal and he could provide food and all these things, but they wanted nothing to do with him. Even the ones who never followed him again, they still received a temporal blessing because they were at least interested. But there are some towns that were so depraved and so cold and so backslidden from God, they didn't want anything to do with Jesus. Some even go so far to say that he was even to a less degree kind of scolding the father of the boy because his faith seemingly was only found in the disciples, and when they couldn't cast out the demon, he was left discouraged. I think the idea overall, and again, I agree with that last one, I think the idea overall was just the great lack of faith that was there at the bottom of the mountain. And what a contrast from the scene from the mountaintop. I mean, we speak of faith becoming sight from Scripture, and we have it in our hymns, and we know it will be like that one day. But to witness transfiguration, that would have been a glimpse of what it's like for faith to actually be sight. And then they go down to the foot of the mountain where there's nothing really but faithlessness everywhere. And so again, maybe he was kind of scolding everyone present to varying degrees. But there's something precious about this, because notice what he says at the end of verse 17. Bring him hither to me. Bring him here. Now there's something I love about that phrase. It kind of makes me giddy in a way, because there's this, now he's going to meet with Jesus. You see it in TV shows or even movies whenever there's a kid being bullied and he's got a friend or better yet, a parent, right? And says, well, you have them come talk to me. And we know what it's like. You're excited to have them. Well, now this boy that was possessed by this horrific demon, now he wasn't going to meet with any one of the apostles. He was going to meet with Jesus. Now we were going to see what would happen. Bring him hither to me. Now there was going to be a change, and with God now present, nothing could remain the same. The Bible tells us here in Matthew, in verse 18, that Jesus rebuked the devil. But I want a fuller picture of all this, so we'll come back to Matthew. If you want to put a bookmark there, if you want to be like me and not put one there, so it makes the sermon last that much longer. Go over with me, if you all would, back to Mark chapter 9. We'll spend a few minutes here. In Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse number 20, at the end of verse 19, we have him again exasperated. He speaks the faithless generation. And again he says, bring him unto me. And so verse 20 is where we pick up. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the Spirit tare him. Now pause for just a moment. When you have a child who's suffering, time seems to slow way down. I'm sure for the Father, there was a great mixture of emotions. I don't know this for sure because obviously I wasn't there, but I'd like to believe that when Jesus spoke, there was this kind of authoritative voice. You all know what I'm talking about? You see this sometimes also in stories. There's someone, they got a big booming voice, one that I don't have, and when they talk, you can't help but listen. I would think, and again, I don't have a chapter to verse, but I want to think that when Jesus spoke, you couldn't help but be enamored by it. And so when the Father heard the words, "Bring him hither to me," I bet there was a great flicker of hope that welled up within this Father. But as they're bringing him the boy, he's actually suffering more. And as we all are familiar with, was he second-guessing himself? I mean, if he didn't bring him, maybe he wouldn't be torn again. Maybe he wouldn't be hurt again. But as soon as that demon saw Jesus, it tore him. That demon knew what was coming, and he wanted to do everything he could before he was commanded to leave. They brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tore him, again verse 20, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. Again, that would have been a horrific sight to actually see. Now, what's interesting about this in verse 21 is that before Christ, again, Matthew just goes to the details. I think Matthew had a different purpose is the reason for it. That's my theory. But we have the extra detail, and he asked his Father. So Christ pauses before healing, before doing anything. He almost pauses, and he says, "How long is it ago since this came unto him?" I wondered, and I suppose it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but why did Jesus ask him that? I honestly, I'm not asking the question because I have an answer. I'm genuinely curious why he asked him that. Maybe it was to bring the Father and all of the witnesses face to face with the awful nature of the predicament. And as we read there in verse 22, and all times he says to him of a child, since he was young, and all times have cast him into the fire and the waters to destroy him. Maybe Christ was bringing all of them face to face with the horrific nature of what was going on. But the Father ends this section with an interesting remark. "If thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us." I would submit that is the plea of a broken man. If thou canst do anything, if there's anything at all you can do, have compassion on us and help us. As noted, after the disciples failed to cast the demon out, any faith the Father had began to waver. And even now, in the presence of the God-man himself, he wasn't so sure Jesus could or would do anything. I like what one writer observed. The leper we read about in Matthew chapter 8 has been several months ago. He doubted if Jesus would be willing to do anything. This Father, though, he doubted if Jesus could do anything. There is a sense in which this didn't show the faith of the Father, but honestly, it showed the lack of the faith the Father had. I think he was that low. He was that low. You know, it's a terrifying thing when a person gets that low. I've heard stories of even in a physical sense, there will be someone who will have a doctor's appointment and they'll get horrible news that the cancer is that far ahead, and in a space of minutes, their whole physical appearance, they age by 20 or 30 years. I don't know if it's worse or better for a person who has spiritual and emotional when they're that low. Thou canst do anything. What's interesting about this is that Jesus responds in kind. We would be tempted to say it was somewhat sarcastic, but obviously it wasn't. As with everything else he said and did, he had a reason for his response. Notice he says in verse 23, Jesus said unto him, "If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth." One writer paraphrases it kind of, and he kind of reverses it on the Father. Where the Father says, if you can do anything, it's almost like Jesus responds as well, if you can believe, all things are possible. I think he put it back on the Father to remind the Father exactly who in whose presence he was. And sometimes, dear Christian, I think God does that to us. Our faith begins to waver, and we have to be reminded exactly whose presence we're in. You know, I have to admit, that is, when given our attention, have you ever thought how scary a church service can be? Don't get me wrong, I would love to see a full church building, a full church sanctuary, anywhere I'm at, here, any church. But you all ever stop to think that in a place like this is the place God said his presence would be? And it doesn't matter if there's 2 or 3 of us. It doesn't matter if there's 2,000 or 3,000 of us. Whose presence matters the most is not any one of us, but it's God's presence here this morning. Sometimes, dear Christian, we have to be reminded exactly whose presence we're in. You all aren't in my presence. I'm not in your presence. We're in the presence of God himself. I think the Father needs to be reminded of that, and so many times, so do we. I think this man needed that, especially after the faithless disciples. And then finally, the Father responds with perhaps the most heartbreaking answer. He says there again in verse number 24, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. It is the paradox, the intersection of belief and unbelief. I believe, but I know I don't believe, but I believe, but I don't, but I do, but I don't. Oddly enough, I've given a lot of thought to this passage of Scripture. It's one of my favorites. And I can't articulate it, but I know how it feels, and I sense that you all do too. I can't put it into words, because how is it that you believe but don't believe? And yet, we've all been there to some degree or another. But here this man was. What I find interesting is that he didn't say, okay, Lord, I'll be back in a week after I fast and pray and be in synagogue school again, and when I'm a little bit more strengthened, I'm going to come back. But rather, he cries out to God, and he just says, Lord, I believe, but help thou mine unbelief. You see, what was on the line was not himself. It was not anyone else, but it was his poor child. And there was nothing else that he could do except just ask the God-man right there, I believe, but help thou mine unbelief. Help thou mine unbelief. Well, at this point, the crowd seems to have been growing more, because notice what it says there in verse 25. When Jesus saw that the people came running together. So I think the idea there is there was already somewhat of a crowd. I think it was growing even more. And it says there in verse 25, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him and enter no more into him. Now there's something so powerful about that, because the disciples couldn't do it. I would even submit that there was no religious leaders. Back in one of the chapters, I don't recall which one it was, but during this time, it was Gill who said that some of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they had their own exorcists, and they used like stinking, rotting fish, thinking it would drive away bad spirits. Not so with Jesus. He just says the words, and he says, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him. I mean, that's powerful within itself. But he goes on to say, and he says there, and enter no more into him. Leave him alone. And just like that, I mean, nothing else. The word of the God, and when God speaks, something happens. We see, of course, the rebellion of the spirit, because it says in verse 26, the spirit cried and rent him sore. I mean, it imagines it was like the very last thing he could do before he had to leave that boy. And it says, and he was one dead, and so much when he said, he's dead. Well, whatever that spirit did, it was so bad, the child seemingly fell to the ground based on the next verse, and they thought he was dead. And it's kind of just a precious picture, but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Some say he died, others didn't. I personally don't think he did, but I still think it's a powerful picture. The child falls to the ground in such a way that everyone thought he was dead. This child, for the very last time, falls to the ground from the torment of the demon, and for the first time in a long time, he stands back up with his hand in the hand of the God-man. That would have been an awesome picture to see, and I bet that father was elated. We're going back to Matthew 17, if you all would, rather quickly. The disciples, they witness all this. They're kind of perplexed. Mark or Luke tells us, Matthew does too. It says there in verse 19, then came the disciples to Jesus apart. Mark or Luke record for us, they went into someone's house and they were, now the service was over, so to speak, and now they're just with Jesus, just the 13 of them now. And they go to Jesus and say, why couldn't we cast him out? I mean, they're perplexed. They're wondering what's changed that we couldn't cast out the demon. Jesus said unto them in verse 20, because of your unbelief. That's it. Because of your unbelief. He goes on to say, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, remove hence from yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. What's interesting about this is that he tells them their essential problem, really what it boiled down to, was their faith. He says if they had the faith of the size of the grain of mustard seed, then they could move mountains. There's some differing ideas on this. Some writers say that the point he's getting at is even just the tiniest amount of faith can move a mountain. Other writers say that this means the mustard seed is a tiny seed but grows exponentially. And if they had the kind of faith that was supposed to be growing and maturing by this point, that they could have cast out the demon. Whichever it was, whichever idea sounds more appealing to you, the point there is that their faith was so small or even unfounded or misfounded that they couldn't cast out the demon. It seems their faith had shrunk so much by this point. Why did it shrink? Some writers give several reasons. Maybe the watching crowd caused them to falter. It's unreal how many times when I'm at home, I can talk like a normal person, but when I get up to do prayer requests and announcements, it's all gone. When you have a crowd staring at you, it's maybe in a more important sense, that's what happened with them. They had a crowd that was watching them. Maybe it was the troubling nature of the demon-possessed child, because honestly, that would have been that would make your hair stand up in your skin if you had to see everything that was going on there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe they thought, well, we know Jesus isn't here and the scribes are here to watch us, but we'll take care of this problem. Maybe it was pride. And in turn, their confidence was now not found in God, but was found in self. One writer even submits that maybe they forgot about the authority Christ had given them, and now they weren't so sure. Fear has a way of doing that. Again, I like what Swindoll had to say about this in his commentary. He wrote, in a sense then, perhaps it wasn't a problem of not having enough faith, as if they needed to just close their eyes, make tight fists, and will more power into their lives. No, even mustard seed faith could move Mount Hermon. True faith, then, is what they needed. The kind of faith that turns from self-confidence to confidence in the power of Jesus Christ alone. MacArthur further expounds on this point. When Christ sent his disciples out in Matthew 10, he explicitly commissioned them to do these kind of miracles. Less than a year later, they fail where they had once succeeded. Christ explains their failure, their lack of faith. This deficiency does not consist in a lack of confidence, because they're surprised that they cannot cast out this demon. They had the confidence to do so. The problem probably lies in a failure to make God, rather than their own gifts, the object of their confidence. True faith, by Christ's definition, always involves surrender to the will of God. What he teaches here is nothing like positive thinking psychology. Jesus says that both the source and the object of all genuine faith, even the weak mustard seed variety, is God. So apparently, they thought, we've done it before, we'll do it again. And they were disappointed. Christ gives them one more note, and it's interesting. He says here in verse 21, howbeit, this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. Never discount the importance of prayer and fasting, dear Christian. It is of utmost importance, especially when we're engaged in spiritual warfare. Very quickly, I want to give us just a few important takeaways from the story. I do appreciate, again, I'll give credit where credit is due in Swindoll's commentary on this. He gives 2 great points from this passage. He wrote, never forget what the Lord taught you in the mountaintop experiences. Y'all ever have 2 separate opposing things happen in one week, And the first half of the week feels like it was from a year ago, and the second half of the week feels like it happened 5 seconds ago, just because it's so diametrically opposed. I can't help but wonder, and it's not recorded for us there. Some writers submit that Peter, James, and John also couldn't cast out the demon. They don't say that explicitly, but they write like it. But can you all imagine going from that mountaintop where it was quite literally heavenly down to the foothills of this mountain where there was this horrific sight of this demon-possessed boy? The truth is, because of God's benevolence, we all have mountaintop experiences where we have great fellowship with God. We've talked about, Brother Rick's talked about the singing at fellowships. Man, I love it. To me, that's a just short but sweet mountaintop experience. And to be honest, when we're on the mountaintop, we feel honestly invincible, not because of confidence in us, but because of the one in whose presence we are. But that leads us to the second point Swindoll makes, and I paraphrase him with another preacher: don't doubt in the dark what God has shown you in the light. As soon as we leave the mountaintop, did I really see that? Because of the change in company, we think, man, this is horrible. I thought things were great, but now that I'm off the mountain, things aren't looking so good. Dear Christian, don't forget, God is the God of the mountaintop and the God of the valley. He is sovereign over both places. Just because the valley is much scarier doesn't mean He's not in control. Don't doubt in the dark what God has shown you in the light. Secondly, never underestimate the power of prayer and fasting. We already touched on this. One is often neglected because of its difficulty. Prayer is hard. It's strangely hard. It's easy, but it's hard. You all know what I'm getting at. The other, fasting, is hardly practiced in our society. And as we see here, we need both. We need both. Number 3, to pause for just a moment. There are numerous lessons on doubt here. It's a powerful passage on doubt. The first thing that occurred to me as I've meditated on this passage before is that the reality of doubt is kind of perplexing. Doubt seems to come from great emotional discouragement. Doubt is not always logical, because reason tells you nothing's changed. Logic would tell you Christ is still the God-man. But because of the emotional weight of seeing your child tormented, you say, if thou canst do anything. Sometimes doubt comes from great emotional discouragement. We're worn down emotionally. Discouragement then settles in, and following discouragement right on its heels is doubt. I do want to be clear. I think there are sinful kinds of doubt. There was a town, they doubted Christ, and they wanted nothing to do with Him. But one thing I've always loved about this passage, Christ never actually scolded this father. He challenged him, but He never scolded him for his doubt. I've met Christians, and if you were to tell them that you wrestled with salvation, they would scold you for it. I never see Christ doing that. I don't see Him scolding Thomas when Thomas doubted. Now, Thomas, I think, quickly believed. I mean, Christ said, you put your fingers in my hands and my side. I think that'd make anyone believe. But Christ never scolded him, and yet so many times we do. There are sinful kinds of doubt that need scolding, don't get me wrong. But there are also other kinds of doubt that doesn't necessarily prove a lack of belief, but a trying of what you believe. There was one writer, I've looked for it and I can't find it for the life of me. He said that doubt can be a good thing. If you're walking in the jungle and come across a rope bridge, before you put one foot on the bridge, you're going to grab that bridge and shake it as hard as you can. And then if it doesn't fall, then you walk across it. Arguably, you shaking it come from a place of doubt. You didn't know if that bridge would hold you. But after you tried it, then you walk across it. One writer said that in the same way, that's what our doubts causes us to do. It makes us try it before we walk across it. One writer even took it a step further, speaking more so to young preachers, but he said, if you have any doubts, try God. Put Him to the test. See where He lands. You personally try Him. Don't go on the word of anyone else. You personally try Him. You have doubts, give it a shot. Again, doubt doesn't necessarily prove a lack of belief, but a trying of what you do believe. And I'll say this about doubt. I've got one more thing and I'll be done. It doesn't matter that you doubt when you do, because it will happen. What matters is what you do when you doubt. It doesn't matter that you do doubt, because it will happen. What matters is what you do when you doubt. Again, when we find ourselves at the intersection of belief and unbelief, too many times our cure to that is to try to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Let me take a sabbatical, I'm going to work on my faith. But not this father. Instead of looking inward to himself, he looked at Christ. Dear Christian, when you doubt, and you will at points, don't look inward, look at Christ. And then lastly, I close with this. May we all examine our faith. Is it sound faith? What is the source of your faith, to go back to what MacArthur said? Is the source of your faith God? Or is the source of your faith your own ability? Is the source of me preaching my own eloquence, which as you all can see is not often that good? Or is it the promise that God will use the preaching of his word? Is the source of your personal faith, dear Christian, yourself? Or is it God? Likewise, what is the object of your faith? Who are you looking to? Who do you hope in? Who do you trust in? In our day and age where positive thinking and self-confidence is so highly exalted, it is so easy to fall into that trap. Dear Christian, may we take a lesson from the disciples and not have confidence in our own abilities, in our own piety, in our own spirituality, in our own service, but may our faith be found truly in our God. May he be both the source and the object of our faith. Let's all stand.